Standalone fantasy. I love it so much that I even wrote my own standalone fantasy novel. Do you like how I managed to plug my own book there? But aside from my medieval Arthurian retelling, I do find that standalone fantasy is definitely harder to come by than fantasy which is in a series. I mean, I think there's just something about particularly like epic fantasy, which we associate with series, with long narratives where we're exploring really large, vast magical worlds, and I completely understand the need for those, and I love fantasy series too, but sometimes you just want a standalone book. And when I'm looking for fantasy recommendations, 9 times out of 10, 9.9 times out of 10, it's a series rather than a standalone. So I thought I would compile some of my favourite standalone fantasies in this video for all of you if you're looking for recommendations of fantasy, you know, that you can be one and done with, that you're not committing to possible series that will never get finished. And maybe, just maybe, I can get some more recommendations of standalone fantasy from all of you in the comments. Before I get into the recommendations, however, I do want to acknowledge that there's a kind of like middle category between fantasy series and standalone fantasy books, which are those fantasy books which exist within series but can kind of be read as standalones. I'm thinking of some of the books in the Discworld series, perhaps the Seven Waters series by Juliet Marillier. There might be like loose story threads that are continued throughout the series, but you can very much just like enjoy the story in a one and done manner. Those are not the books I'm going to talk about in this video, but I will, you know, like pop some of my favourites up on the screen here so that you can check them out if you're interested. But I do want to focus in on those true standalones in this video. Right, so these books are in no particular order, but since I've already mentioned the author, let's talk about one of the very few standalone books written by my favourite fantasy author, Juliet Marillier, and that is Heart's Blood. So Heart's Blood is actually a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, and the sort of fairy tale retelling genre is definitely one in which I find more standalone fantasies in, perhaps because, you know, the author is tackling the fairy tale in that confined space. You know, they have the narrative set out for them and they can kind of deal with it in one story. So there are definitely some more fairy tale retellings in this list. But I just love Juliet Marillier. Aside from this book, which is obviously an absolutely phenomenal addition to her canon, I am just a big fan. She is one of the most beautiful, lyrical, atmospheric, spiritual way writers. Like, her prose are stunning and she always creates such a sense of place, emotion. She's so sensitive with her characters, who can often start off quite unassuming, but getting to know them is an absolute privilege throughout the narrative of the story. And this book, like many of her others, is set in a fantasy historical take on medieval Ireland, and it follows a young scribe named Catrin, and Catrin is fleeing her own demons. She is escaping her own past and her own present, looking for something new, and she finds herself in this castle which everyone else avoids because there's this dark, mysterious cloud surrounding it, perhaps a curse even, maybe, and there's something strange and dark and almost sinister about the lord of this castle. Of course, like I said, this is inspired by Beauty and the Beast, so you can kind of predict where some of that might end up going, but I think Juliet Marillier puts a beautiful spin on the story, really makes it her own and fleshes out these characters in a way that's just gorgeous to read about. So I would highly recommend, whether or not you're a Beauty and the Beast fan or not, this is a fantastic fantasy novel. If you're looking for something you can read in a day though, however, you want a novella, then let me recommend to you Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard. Now, this is another fantasy author who I absolutely love. She also writes sci-fi and novels which kind of blur between sci-fi and fantasy, like The Vanisher's Palace. But in Fireheart Tiger, we follow a young woman who is struggling with a sort of magical ability she never expected to have. This isn't like something she was born with, it's something that has sort of grown within her in the past few years, and it caused a devastating fire in her previous home, and now she's kind of trying to like push it down and make sure it doesn't cause any more problems back in her mother's kingdom, or queendom, I suppose. Of course it's not a kingdom, it's a queendom. If that wasn't enough, however, there's also the fact that her mother doesn't really take her seriously despite being the heir to the throne, and her ex-girlfriend has turned up as a sort of ambassador to a much more powerful queendom, which is sort of looking to possibly make an alliance in which our main character's queendom is the subordinate. And it's a book which also explores colonialization through a fantasy lens, and it's a question of whether this old romance will be rekindled, whether she can embrace who she is, what exactly is this magic that's happening around her, who else might possibly be involved, And for a novella, actually, it's kind of packed with a lot, but it manages to work in a novella setting because it's all about how this relates to our protagonist in her role as heir to the throne, struggling with her own identity, who she is, and the power that she might one day hold and which she possibly currently holds, and like just all of that inner turmoil. Like, it's quite a lot to deal with, isn't it? And it's beautiful. I think it explores beautifully colonialization, toxic relationships, kind of familial relationships with the mother and the protagonist, and I would actually love more books set in this world. Like, I would love more books about these characters, but I also appreciate that it's a standalone, and if you're looking for a beautiful sapphic fantasy novel, then this is one to check out. In case you have ever doubted the power and potential of a standalone fantasy novel, however, I want to talk about a book which manages to host multiple POVs, and I mean more than two, at least four I think, in one story set across time and within a complex magical world full of universities, libraries, palaces, and people of different stations interacting. Then, like, it's all happening in this book and it manages to do it well, and that's Alphabet of Thorn by Patricia A. McKillip, another absolute classic fantasy writer. And in this story we follow, like I said, multiple POV characters, but for me it feels like the main character, and maybe that's just because whenever I read a multiple POV book I kind of pick one who's my favourite, is our young translator. But we also begin the story with our young translator who has been raised by this magical library university, and I did talk about this book a little bit in my Magical Academia recommendations video, and she has a real knack for translating, and she's found this book written in the Alphabet of Thorn, a language that no one has ever been able to decipher until she comes along, because for some reason it just clicks, it just works with her, and you'll learn why that is as the book progresses. And it's about how this book and the story contained in this book and the magic contained in this book links all of our characters together, both across time, across magical settings, and how it also potentially puts them in danger, and how they end up having to work together to like make sure everybody's okay. Next up is a YA fantasy novel inspired by Korean mythology and folklore, and that is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axe-O. I absolutely loved this take on the traditional sort of dragon sea god that you find in different mythologies, and in this case inspired by Korean stories. And it's about our main character Mina, whose brother's love, his fiance, has been chosen as this year's sacrifice. So it's set in a village where every year they have to sacrifice a bride to the sea god in order to appease him, to maintain the safety of their home, to like just, you know, keep everything going smoothly. Classic sacrifice story. And obviously these women never come back, and it's tragic that Mina's brother is about to lose his fiance, but you know, she's going out there willingly for her people until Mina decides, nope, actually I love these people, I love my brother, I love his fiance, they are my family, they mean the world to me, I'm going in instead. And she jumps beneath the waves in order to sacrifice herself to the sea god. Of course, the gods and other mythical beings beneath the sea are a little bit surprised to see her. They weren't really expecting her. She's not who they planned to receive, but she might be exactly what they need, and she may be able to sort of bring an end to this kind of toxic relationship, shall we say, between gods and mortals, and maybe improve everything for everybody. Mina is a really fun character because she is obviously incredibly headstrong and maybe doesn't always make the right choices, but she is also passionate and loyal and fierce, and that gets her exactly where she needs to be, and is also what helps her win everybody over, including the reader. So it's such a beautiful narrative. Love the otherworldly, underwater, mythical setting. It's absolutely stunning, and obviously seeing all of that mythology woven into this fresh new story. Next up, I have a book which I would very much class as romantasy, and if anything, it's kind of a contemporary romance with a element of fantasy, but I still thought it would be nice to include here because I do think the magic is what makes it so unique and so endearing as a reader, and that is Best Hex Ever by Nadia El Fassi. So this is a dual POV between our male and female love interests, in which our male love interest is a museum curator kind of trying to decolonise the British Museum, shall we say, and then our female protagonist is a baker slash witch. So she is a kitchen witch. She's somebody who has been raised with magic in her household. Her mother is a witch too, and it's something that's been passed down throughout her family down the lines of women. But in particular, she channels her magic through what she cooks and what she makes to drink, through her brews and her recipes. And she uses this skill to set up a cafe in London where she basically just uses like what I think is the most beautiful kind of magic, which is where she sort of imbibes kind of the cakes and coffees you might buy there with little sparks of confidence that you might need that day, or a little like oomph before you go to a job interview, or a little bit of comfort when you're feeling alone and far away from home. And I just love the way magic is kind of entwined throughout this book. I think it would have made a lovely contemporary romance. They're both wonderful characters, but the magic for me is just what levitated it to that 5 stars. I thought it was so beautiful, and it was this beautiful, and it was both a beautiful representation of what I perceive as the magic that exists in our real world, through those like little gestures and those little acts of kindness, and the way that kind of like everything around us is a little bit magical, and also as a metaphor it works really, really well. But there's also an issue here in that our witchy protagonist has a curse on her, a hex, which has sort of destined all of her relationships to end badly. It has doomed her love life really since she was a student, and she's been struggling with that, as well as internal turmoil around coming out to her mother. She worries her mother might hold some conservative beliefs that won't accept her as bisexual, and she's been like internalizing all of this stuff, this hex, this curse, her like fear of coming out, in whilst helping everybody else around her, until she meets this man who's actually the best man at her best friend's wedding, and they haven't had a chance to meet before, and it seems like they might be perfect for each other, but she kind of has to deal with all this stuff if she's going to make it work. And it's so stunning. Like, it's one of my favourite romance novels of all time, and I love, love, love the fantasy element, so I had to include it here. So I mentioned in this video there would be a few fairy tale retellings, but I didn't actually think about the fact that there's actually just a few Beauty and the Beast retellings in here. I can't help it. I'm a sucker for Beauty and the Beast retelling, and quite a few of my favourites are standalones. So let's talk about another one, and that is Intreat Me by Grace Draven. So Intreat Me is interesting as a Beauty and the Beast retelling because actually our POV characters and our main romance, although there's also another like romance subplot between 2 other characters, isn't between Beauty and the Beast. It's between their father and their older sister. So our protagonist is actually a widow. She's in her maybe like late 30s or 40s. She's been through all this love stuff before. She loved her previous husband, and it's her younger sister who's the one sort of spirited away in an exciting love affair by a young handsome man. Of course, however, she's not just going to let her sister go off with this stranger, and she says, I'm coming too. So she follows her to this castle where she meets said young dashing lord man's father, who is also a little bit dubious and a little bit suspicious of this whole romance, and the 2 of them kind of have to watch over these 2 younger people in the like first blushes of new young love, after having, you know, had their own relationships in the past and maybe developing feelings for one another. Of course, there is a curse. I don't want to give away the details of how the Beauty and the Beast curse manifest in this novel because I think it's really interesting, especially with the dynamic of there being 4 characters in this castle as well as the servants. So I won't say much more than that, but obviously you can expect certain things, you can predict certain things to happen in a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but I really loved Grace Draven's approach to the story, and I love our protagonist, particularly our female protagonist. She is so strong-willed. I love that she isn't, you know, like 18 years old. I love that she's a little bit older, and I think it's so well done. Next up we have a novel inspired by a traditional British or Celtic folk ballad, and that is Sister Song by Lucy Holland. So this novel is inspired by the story of the Twa sisters, which is a folk tale that, like I mentioned, is preserved in this traditional ballad, and it's told from the perspective of 2 sisters and their trans brothers. So it's a book which explores love, family dynamics, and also gender identity in a sort of late ancient early medieval period of British history, particularly set in the Brythonic kingdom of Dumnonia, and it is such a beautiful, heartfelt, gut-wrenching, emotional read. Each of these siblings is trying to make their own way in a world that has very specific expectations for them, and they all have very distinct personalities, which I also really appreciate in any book that has multiple POVs. The fact that the characters can feel so distinct and so their own, and that you're not just reading about the same person with a different name in each chapter. So that is something I really, really appreciate. And yeah, each one is trying to like figure out how they fit into this world and also approach issues that might potentially set them against one another. So it's a story, like I said, about love, it's about family, it's about loyalty, it's about finding yourself and figuring out who you are, and it is such a beautiful take on this traditional folk ballad. Lucy Holland has a beautiful way with words, and she really sort of takes you back in time to this very magical version of our past, and it's very transportive. The prose are very rich and the setting just comes to life in her words. And I'm always on the hunt for more books inspired by traditional Celtic stories, so this is one I would highly recommend. And if you'd like a video more generally on that subject, let me know. Another book which I believe would qualify as a novella, maybe it's on the sort of longer end of novella, sort of between 150 and 200 pages, but which I also adore and makes for fantastic standalone fantasy reading, is The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zen Cho, another favourite writer of mine. So this is a found family story inspired by traditional Chinese martial art narratives, and it follows a group of bandits and their latest recruit. So at the beginning of the story, a group of bandits, or a bandit, walk into a coffee house, and no, it's not the beginning of a joke, although there is plenty of humour in this story, and things go downhill from there. Drama ensues, and one of the employees at this coffee house, who's having a bit of a rubbish time, decides to go along with them, and they all start to learn interesting things about each other. I don't want to give everything away, but you can expect a kind of monstrous regiment-esque storyline here, and they don't always rub along great at the beginning, but like I said, it's a found family narrative, which is a ton of fun. It's like a fun adventure filled with emotion and heart, and the characters are absolutely fantastic. And also, if I'm being honest, I could probably read a bunch more books about the same characters, but I also appreciate that it is a standalone. We then have another fantasy great, and that is a book by Robin McKinley, specifically Chalice. Now I know this isn't the only standalone fantasy book in Robin McKinley's back catalogue, so again, if you're looking for an author who's just written a bunch of standalone fantasy, then definitely check them out. But this is one of my favourites because I feel like it's sort of like the precursor or an early version of what we now term cozy fantasy, and with the rise in popularity of cozy fantasy, I think it's fun to look back at some books, some older books that we would probably class under that subgenre now. And it's about a beekeeper. It's about a woman who is a beekeeper, and she lives in this sort of magical medieval type world with its own religious system. And when a position opens up for a sort of religious official, shall we say, in this world, she is the one chosen to fill it. She wasn't really expecting this. This wasn't really where she saw her life going, but despite the sort of learning curves, it also ends up kind of being like one of the best things that could have happened to her, really. Like, it's a fresh new start, and some wonderful things come of it, and it's about her finding her place with this new powerful magical religious role, and also her dynamic with the priest who she is to serve. And there is like a soft romance in it. I don't know if I'd necessarily term this book primarily a romance, but there is that kind of soft undercurrent of romance in there, and I just generally find it quite like a charming, sort of cozy book. That's exactly how I would describe it, if I'm being honest. It's one of those soft books where there's not a lot of like high drama, but what is there is really impactful, and it's really beautiful to read. Then last but not least, I want to finish off with another novella, and that is The Black God's Drums by P. Shelley Clark. So this is a book which sort of sits in that position of kind of halfway between sci-fi and fantasy for me. Like, it's just peak speculative fiction, and like with most of P. Shelley Clark's writing, it's set in an alternative version of our world. I feel like all of his books are either set in like alternative historical pasts or alternative like present slash futures, so it's an alternative version of New Orleans, and we follow Creeper, a young girl who is sort of like looking to escape her current situation in life, and she wants to join one of the sort of sky ships, but she also has a secret, and that is that there is an Orisha either inside her or kind of always with her, talking to her, and that is the Orisha Oya, who is in control of like thunderstorms and other aspects of nature. And it's about Creeper joining this crew. If you love like a kind of, again, like sort of found family get together aboard a ship, whether it's a sea ship or a sky ship, etc., this is the perfect novel for you. And how they kind of end up responsible for saving the world from this danger known as the Black God's Drum. And like I said, I've read a few books by PJ Clark and I always love his world building. Like, it's so creative, what he does and how he plays around with history and incorporates different technologies and mythologies within all of that. I absolutely love it, and this is a really nice taster of his work if you then want to go into reading his series, like his Jinn series, which I absolutely adore as well, or even his horror books like Ring Shout. But for fantasy or fantasy sci-fi crossover, this is an excellent place to go. I think with that, however, we have reached 10 books, which seems like a good number for this video. So hopefully I've at least brought to your attention one new title when it comes to standalone fantasy that you might want to check out, or encouraged you to read one that you'd already heard about but weren't sure, because these are all fantastic books. Like I said, I do also happen to have my own Sapphic Arthurian retelling or medieval fantasy novel, which is very much a standalone and will also be linked in the description box down below if you're interested in checking that out. But so will all of the other books I've talked about, and I'd love to hear more about your favourite standalone fantasy novels. I'm always on the hunt for more to add to my TBR. So until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.